Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out to you on your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room TVs. My name's Rachel Burton and I'm a producer at Watershed. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that really excite us. An especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio or for whom this may be the first time you're engaging with us. For all of those newcomers, here's a little bit more about what we do. The Pervasive Media Studio is a diverse and collaborative community, exploring creativity and technology, exploring everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of the West of England and the University of Bristol. We're a home for early ideas, companies, and a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. It's a studio space, offering desk space, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, and it's all for free. It's a safe space for artists to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. We also run research projects. So during September, the teams behind the Southwest Creative Technology Network and Bristol+Bath Creative R+D have taken over the Lunchtime Talks, showcasing the work of our research fellows and looking at everything from data to digital placemaking and responsible innovation, which you'll hear a lot more about today. I'm a producer for Bristol+Bath Creative R+D, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. We are a collaboration between Bristol and Bath's 4 universities and Watershed that aims to support the region's creative and technology industries. Our 5-year programme seeks to forge connections and partnerships in Bristol and Bath, sharing knowledge, creating crossovers, and even greater opportunities in what's already one of the most vibrant clusters in the UK. For this week's talk, we welcome Alex Mecklenburg and Sam Brown. We've been working with Alex and Sam since the start of this year, initially with Everyone, and now as co-founders of their newly formed company, Consequential. They are fellows of the programme researching responsible technology, and they've been running workshops for our cohorts and our programme team alongside their own research. I am so excited for Alex and Sam to share their thinking with you today. They've had a huge impact on our team and our cohorts of fellows and businesses, in our thinking and also in the way we shape our processes. Consequential is a community interest company which supports those who invest, accelerate or scale digital and emerging technologies in building their own responsible innovation practices. In today's talk, Alex and Sam will explore how the culture of an organisation is integral to its ability to thrive and be a responsible member of its community. Alex and Sam are really keen to hear your thoughts, so they will be posing some provocations to you throughout the talk. We'll pop those in the chat, so please share your responses in the chat and get involved in the conversation. There will also be a Q&A at the end, and the talk will run for roughly 30 minutes, with another 30 minutes for Q&A. If you want to ask any questions, just pop them in the chat window and I'll pick them out to ask the speakers. Or if you like, you can tweet your questions to @PMStudio UK. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. So quickly, before we start, I want to tell you what next week's talk is. Localising the internet, 3 perspectives on digital placemaking. As we come to the end of the first Bristol+Bath Creative R+D Pathfinder in digital placemaking, we invite Rosanna Diaz, Stephen Hilton and Mike Rawlinson, 3 members of the research cohort, to share their thinking. Around the world, corporate giants are aligning with governments and local authorities to create new, smart, digitally enabled streets, waterfronts, and even new build cities. But where does the local community fit in, if at all? This talk will consider 3 perspectives on localising the internet, exploring what a digital local city might mean to Bristol, Bath and beyond. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link now on any of your socials so your friends can come and listen too. So that's it for me. For now, I'm going to hand over to today's speakers, Alex and Sam.
Thank you, Rachel, for that absolutely brilliant introduction. And I have to say that next talk sounds fascinating. So as you've said, we're Consequential. I'm Sam, this is Alex. And we're a newly founded community interest company focused on responsible innovation within organizations. We were incubated within Everyone, the responsible technology think tank, where we researched, experimented, tested, and learned what responsible innovation could look like and how to do it, with some of that work actually taking place here in Bristol and with Watershed as early pioneers. But with the pandemic and all of the events of this year, the world has changed. We know we're at an inflection point, a time where reimagining and rethinking is taking place and people are demanding change now. And this is why when it was time for Everyone to sail off into the sunset, we felt the moment was right for us to found Consequential, to continue to experiment and to see business done differently. We want to see businesses and communities in truly reciprocal relationships with each other, where both parties benefit and shape each other. And we want to see innovations that are going to change the world in ways that benefit everyone and will support the planet and all of us on it. As Consequential, we make this change seem possible by supporting those who invest, accelerate, and scale digital and emerging technologies with responsible innovation. We do both big I innovation and little I innovation to change the existing business landscape. This means we focus on both large-scale systems change within business and technology, and change within individual organizations to build their businesses and products in more responsible ways. I'm going to hand over to Alex for a moment just to help explain a little bit more about what we believe in as Consequential.
Thank you, Rachel. Sam, sorry, I'm getting this mixed up at the very beginning. So both of us are practitioners. We truly and deeply believe in experimentation. And what was really exciting was that we realized that we both had a dream to treat our organization like a prototype. And for us, that means that we test ideas on how can we do business differently and be accountable to our communities. And we're testing that pretty much every day. We share what we know so that we're approaching our clients with humility and empathy. And we also believe in modeling with intent. We try to model what we want to see with curiosity and kindness, because we believe that what you put out in the world will ultimately come back to you. And this is why we are always trying to be generous with our ideas and strive to always do best quality work so that we can see the change in our communities. And the reason why we're sharing so much about what we believe and what our business does is because we are both very intentional about articulating those beliefs. And this is why we're actually super delighted to be here today. I wish I could be in Bristol, love Bristol, but this has to do for the moment being. We know that in everything we say and do, we're actually creating our own organizational culture in which we do business. And over the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to share with you why we believe that culture should never be seen as a byproduct of organizations. We will share our thoughts on why organizations need to be intentional in the cultures they create, and we will offer up tips and ideas of how to build strong, responsible organizational cultures. But before we jump right in, let's spend 2 minutes on the definition of what organizational culture is. As with most things, there are so many different definitions around the idea of organizational culture. So we wanted to share the ones that we feel are the most helpful and sense-making, at least to us. And to do that, I will start with the definition of organizational culture that we do not subscribe to as consequential. So according to Investopedia, organizational culture refers to the beliefs and behaviors that determine how a company's employees and management interact and handle outside business transactions. And see, Sam and I believe that culture is a collective guide of how the organization and every single of its employees and leaders behave inside and outside of business transactions, always. So I'm going to open up for a question for you, the audience, and it would be great if you could type your answers into the chat, and then we'll invite Rachel to read out some of those answers. So the question that we would love to hear from you is, what are examples of organizational cultures that you admire? Or maybe cultures you don't like? And a sentence on why. So what are examples of organizational cultures you admire or cultures you don't like? Why? And while some of you are typing, let me give you 2 other ways of grasping the meaning of culture for an organization. I would assume a lot of you focus on strategy within your organization. So let's look at culture through the lens of strategy. Strategy offers a formal logic to the company's goals and orients people around them. Culture expresses goals through values and beliefs and guides activity through shared principles, assumptions, and practices. You've probably heard the adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Personally, I believe that they need to be deeply intertwined all the time. And then, as a last definition, there's a super informal description. Culture is what happens when nobody is looking. Culture determines everything. So, Rachel, do you want to have a look at some of the comments in the chat?
We're waiting at the moment for some to come through, but I can share one of mine with you.
That's great.
So Slung Low, as a company based in Leeds, I really admire their culture. The way they hire people, they just look for people who will add value to their team. They don't have set roles that they put out as job descriptions. They're looking specifically for people, and I think the value that puts on individuals is kind of sets up an amazing culture to start with. So we've had a couple of people comment that it's actually really difficult to come up with examples. Okay, there's a few coming in. Anna says, I think it's interesting that I don't have a ton of orgs that quickly come to mind for cultures I admire, but agreeing that Slung Low. Yeah, I think people are struggling to think of examples. And it's Joe says, I think it's really hard to understand a culture unless you're part of it.
That's really interesting. And we're going to explore that later on a little bit more. Sam will be talking about that.
There aren't any more coming through at the moment, so I think people are reflecting on that provocation.
Okay, we'll give people some more time to reflect on that, and maybe we can come back to that in the Q&A section then. I'm going to talk to you for the next few minutes about the connection between culture and values and leadership and decision making. So culture is your values brought to life within your organization. Culture happens whether you mean it to or not. And one of the biggest reasons that culture matters so much for achieving what you envision is because it shows up in every aspect of organizational decision making. And how you make decisions is inherently showing what your values are. Again, whether you mean to or not. The culture of your organization will determine how decisions are made, what the decision-making process looks like, and who gets to have input. If you want your culture to be based on the values that you want your organization to have, then you should be focused on ensuring your decision-making process brings those values to life. So for example, if you value collaboration, every decision you make should be modeling a collaborative decision-making process. And this is being intentional about how you design and conduct decision-making processes within your organization, matching your values to the way you operate. And this is the difference between values printed on the wall and values that are lived every day in your organization. This is about making your values true through your culture. And to someone's point, this is actually a really big part about how your organization will be known. Your culture is how you're representing your organization to the world and the experiences that people have with your organization. So to help you think of other examples, what is an organization that you've had a transaction with that you really enjoyed? Perhaps their customer service was really fun or very supportive or very responsive. All of those things are indicative of that organization's culture, both inside and outside. And for leaders, whether of an organization, a team, or a program, no matter how big or small, every time that you make a decision, you're showing your values and you are modeling a decision-making process for others. And because of this, You need to be aware at all times of what you're signaling to the people in your organization about your values, because how you make those decisions is creating a culture for your team and for an organization that they'll follow. So I'm going to open up back to the audience again for another question. This one's a bit more personal. We want you to reflect in the last 3 weeks. Can you think of an example of where your values came through in decision making? What did that look like? We want to hear your stories about that. So I'm just going to repeat that again for a moment. Reflect in the last 3 weeks. Can you think of an example of where your values came through in your decision making? And what did that look like? While we're waiting for your answers, I'm going to give some questions you can ask yourself about intentional culture building. What are values that are important to me? What should I be considering in making this decision? Who should I be involving in making this decision? Am I making my process of decision-making visible to everyone else in the organization so they can repeat it? So to go back to our question one last time, can you think of an example of where your values came through in your decision-making? And what did that look like? Rachel, do you want to share any thoughts that have come up in the chat so far?
So we're still waiting for some thoughts to come through. Just to reflect a little bit on what you were saying about values printed on the wall, and what your actual values are in your culture. Hillary commented earlier, I also don't believe most companies, because they say one thing publicly but privately are totally different. And I think that is what makes it so hard. When it's not so visible what your actual values and culture are.
And Alex will talk a bit more about that in a moment, but one of the biggest challenges for organizations, as we said, is making those values true in the experience that the people who work for you have every day. And when there's a disjoint between what you state you value and what actually happens in your processes on a day-to-day basis, people tend to rebel against that.
So Claire says, I think Watershed's values come through in how we have reopened, clear, open and accessible. Claire says, obviously I would say that she is the CEO of Watershed.
I think that's a brilliant example though. We'll share one from Consequential actually. So at the moment, we're trying to decide who our main bank will be as we run our operations. And, we're trying to weigh not only the very practical things such as do they offer debit cards, what is their sign up process, how much are their fees, but also how does that bank operate, and are we comfortable with the ethics of that bank, and are we comfortable with what that bank does in the world, and are we willing to do business and align ourselves with that? And we think by weighing that equally with those other things, we are really living what we say in terms of what we want to see in the world.
There's one example actually that Claire shared to the earlier provocation, but links to this, is Para Orchestra, who are a Bristol-based disability-led orchestra, and they're amazing. And she says their staff are always careful, kind and thoughtful, and they really embody that in the way that they are and they do their work. Claire says Triodos in terms of bank.
We are actually signed up with Triodos as our savings account bank, but we need a commercial bank to do daily transactions.
I think people are mulling it over. We don't have any more in the chat at the moment. Lots of freeing though.
I'll hand over to Alex then for the next thoughts.
Thank you. Sam has spoken fabulously, as she always does, about intent, role modeling and decision making, and the importance of focus in creating and shaping the culture that you want to be part of. And whereas all of this is very important, as much as bringing focus and intent to the journey, organizations need to make space for the fact that organizations are actually made up by messy humans. And the ones of you who have worked with me before hear me say that again and again and again. Just keep in mind, we're all messy humans and organizations are created by messy humans. And that is incredibly important when you are building culture, to dance in the moment and to be aware that if 2 or 3 messy humans come together, messiness can happen. So every new human joining the organization, partnering with an organization, investing in an organization, will bring their own values and behaviors into the organization and in its culture. Every event shapes an organization and a culture, and every injection of cash shapes a culture. As a really, timely example, maybe some of you have followed the press coverage of Oatly, when Oatly actually gave the Trump-linked private equity investor firm Blackstone a 10% stake in their company. And people pointed out that they felt there was a disconnect between the culture that Oatly were living on the one side and the decision on partnering with the investor firm. And that is why it's really important to be aware of the many different humans and stakeholders involved in the organization. First and foremost, that involves the people you hire or partner to work with. Each and every human who's going to join your organization is probably also very keen to introduce new thinking and new behaviors. That can be delivery principles, approaches, frameworks, and you need to be thinking about that as much as you are probably thinking about the skills and the capabilities that they bring. How are you going to work with them to continue to build and model the culture you want? And a really difficult thing, how are you designing for diversity of beliefs and behaviors on the one side, and for alignment in decisions and actions on the other? How can the team share decision-making around the same principles without losing the richness of a diverse culture? There's a lot of testing involved in here. And just being together, talking with each other, connecting with each other. The right team is a huge factor in success and in receiving investment. And you need to be building a culture that is aligned not only to your vision, but most importantly also how you want to achieve that vision together. And done well, this will enforce your culture and will improve it. Responsibility and sustainability. And therefore, it's value to both the community, your customers, maybe also your investors. So I'm handing back to Sam, who's going to explore the idea of responsibility in context of building strong organizational cultures.
So given what we know now about culture, that it shows up in decision-making and it's your values brought to life, what can we do to create responsible cultures within our organization? We believe that the values of a business should ultimately be deeply connected to the values of its community. As Consequential, we want to see decision-making and the process of innovation to always be grounded in and responsible for the interest of communities. For us, responsible innovation comes down to 3 principles: being open and accountable with your intent, being aware of the potential consequences of your business decisions and taking steps to address them, and being inclusive and thoughtful about your stakeholders and who you involve in the innovation process. So to reiterate what we had said earlier, every decision you make is a building block that over time is going to set the culture, the values, and the ethical direction of your organization. So an organization that's trying to embed responsible cultures and responsible decision-making will try to build one that encourages open and accountable decision-making processes, where different stakeholders are openly considered and longer-term consequences explored. And we believe that this is how you build something that lasts, something bigger than yourself, by paying attention to the interconnectedness between your business, its operations, your product, and the impact that you're having in the world.
And responsibility is a scale. That's very, very important to remember. Often people think about, oh, this is responsible and this is not responsible. We love to think in black and white as humans. But actually, building a responsible culture is about actively deciding where you want to sit on that scale in every single of your decisions. So it requires that you constantly ask out aloud, what are the implications for people, profit, planet, and how are we balancing them? And you need to find ways of doing this together as one organization, so that people where you sit on the scale, so that people really understand where you sit on the scale of responsibility and why. And that is important for everybody who's working in the organization, everybody who's maybe partnering around a new project. If you do that, then responsible culture can help you thrive. And it also helps you to stay in check and allows others in the organization to actually hold you to account. So you see, the culture you create becomes the lens that everybody views the decisions through. And one really important thing to remember about culture is sticky, really, really sticky. And what I mean with that is you can hang up new principles on the wall. You can change your manifesto. I work with a lot of companies who are very excited changing their manifestos every 2 years. But don't forget, culture sits within the humans of an organization. Culture does not hang on the wall. So humans remember very well. And even if the manifesto is changed, it is still deeply embossed on your employee soul. So we have one last provocation question before we are going to go to the DNA. Culture is a living form. It is not stagnant, but it is constantly changing. What does that mean for responsibility? How can you keep the culture responsible? If you could type your answers in the chat, that would be really, really helpful. So I repeat the question again. Culture is a living form. It isn't stagnant, but it is constantly changing. So what does that mean for making sure that it stays responsible? What do you need to do in your organization? Any thoughts, any ideas would be super interesting for us, because it is a question that we ask ourselves every single day. And while you're typing, just to enforce that we're seeing, especially today, how cultures are changing, and maybe what was perfectly responsible in February 2020 has become irresponsible within only 5 months. Wow. How have you responded in your organizations? Rachel, when we are starting to see some responses, would be lovely if you could read them out aloud.
We do have some responses, and actually during that section there were lots of questions that came through, and I will pick those up in the Q&A. People are really enjoying your talk. So from Hilary, she says, I think you need an open feedback loop internally where people feel safe to criticize and also independent help. One from Anna, through thinking about it as an ecosystem, a living thing, so you can get a bit of your ecosystem, a bit of ecosystem influences and requires the other bits. From Vivian, for our team, we are working on using a lens of care as an organising principle. Cultures are fluid, our ethic of care remains. And one more from Claire, by being permeable and understanding the context of the systems you are operating are also always changing.
Claire, I love that. Be permeable, always.
So I'm just going to very quickly summarize, and then we'll hand over to Rachel for some of the Q&A. There are a lot of people who see culture as the thing that wraps itself around an organization. We believe culture is actually at the heart of how you operate, and that responsible organizational culture is at the heart of responsible business. To see business done differently, we want to turn over to you and leave you with one question to take on. How is your organizational culture connected with and responsible to the communities in which you live, work, and play? And with that, Thank you for listening to us, and we will hand over to Rachel and address some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Alex and Sam. That was a brilliant talk and some really powerful insights, and I think lots and lots of questions and reflections that people now have. It's been such a delight to work with you, and I really want to say that, so I'm keen to hear all of the questions. Please do keep sharing them in the chat, or you can tweet us. So we will move on to the Q&A now. I'm going to scroll back in the chat a little bit because there were some questions that popped up earlier on that I think it would be good to bring in now. So there's a question that came through, a similar question from Vivian and also from Hilary around larger companies. So Vivian says, think about a cohesive singular culture is almost impossible. You end up with patchwork collections of often clashing cultures. And Hilary says, but how do you do this when you join a massive juggernaut and you're in one section of that? So they feel quite similar to me. So thinking about a large company with lots of different departments or elements to it and you're one person, how do you influence change or think about responsibility in that situation?
Sam, do you want to take that one?
So I think there's a few answers on that, and it's very similar to the question we asked about how do you stay responsible within evolving and constantly changing ecosystems and time. And a big part of that is going back to, as Alex said, understanding that responsibility is a scale, and you need to be constantly checking in with yourself on where are you on that scale, what can you influence within your space to do that. And coming back to what Claire had said in response to our question, while there may be a mishmash of different types of cultures and different types of decision making happening across a large organization, there should always be at its core a couple of consistent through lines in terms of what is important to that organization and what values come through in not only its decision-making processes, but its incentives and how performance is measured and what it values in terms of success.
Yeah, and I love that. So I worked with an organization a couple of years ago, and they started out and they were very proud of their amazing culture. And then they started to grow, and they had two prevalent cultures. They had an engineering culture and they had a design culture. And when I walked in, there was this desire from the CEO to create one culture. And I had lots of discussions with him about that, because I said, actually, no, but what you need to make sure is you need to create a membrane, so permeable. Where do they connect? And where do they actually thrive in their uniqueness? So we created, because, hey, you need to make it a bit marketingly, don't you? But we created this idea about a double helix that is just, waving itself around with different strings of culture, making it actually even stronger than it would be if it would be one culture. And we started to focus on where are those moments where things need a flow, and where are those moments when actually the diversity of opinion is perfectly fine, but we need to create an environment that can be managed in a way that, again, all the strings are happy with. I hope that gives a bit of texture.
Yeah, and I'll add I'll add on with just a bit of personal experience, having come from working in a very large organizational juggernaut, as they say, and actually being actively involved in creating the culture and the organizational strategy, which embedded that. And one of the observations I have from that is you will always have people who engage in what we used to call kingdom building. The people who want to create their own cultures and their own values within an organization and have their own power and their own way of doing things. And without fail, over years, what ended up happening is the farther that those kingdoms got from the core of the actual business and what it valued, the more likely it was that they would be reorged and scattered to the winds. And so there is a bit of self-correcting that happens within good organizations that keeps everything coming back to the core.
Thank you. That's so useful. This is really interesting conversation. So I'm going to share another question. Claire would like to hear a little bit about the process of starting something new and being so aware of getting this right. So you are in a unique position of just setting up a brand new company focused on culture and intention and responsibility. What have you done? How are you getting this right?
Being super open with each other, creating a safe space to explore that. And sometimes I use weird coachy language, so apologies, but it's this balance between standing in the lion's roar, which means something is roaring at you and you want to run away, but you just stand there. It's okay, it'll sort itself out somehow, and dance in the moment and checking back in with each other. I think Sam and I, actually, when we founded our organization, we did a session of team coaching. And that was super helpful because we agreed, how do we want to be when really difficult things happen? And we contracted with that. So prototyping, testing, checking in with each other. Obviously, we both are exposed to the practice that is called consequence scanning. So we are consequence scanning a lot in our business, which means if we do that, what might happen? What is it that we want to intend? And what might happen that we haven't intended? And then are we okay with that? Or do we want to mitigate that? Sam?
And I'll certainly echo and support everything Alex just said. And I think the really big thing for us was we put that first. When we started our organization, the first thing we said was, we need to ensure that we are walking the walk, talking the talk, and that we are starting with ourselves to do everything it is we want to see everyone else doing. And so we started talking about our values and our principles before we started talking about our products and our services. And I think that in and of itself, being led that way and having that always come first, it leads every other decision we make in terms of, going back to the banking. It was more, well, what are the ethical banks that we might want to operate with? And then we'll look into if they fulfill our needs on an operational level.
Where can people go to find out a little bit more about consequence scanning as a process, because it is so useful?
It lives on tech-transformed.com, and it's free to download. So you can go, there's a little tab on there called Consequence Scanning. It has a guide and a manual that will walk you through everything you need to know, as well as some prompts and various headings for you. But also, obviously, you can always just email Alex and I, and we'll be more than happy to engage with you.
Thank you. So the chat has turned to talking a little bit about playfulness and silliness and seriousness, which is great. So we have a question from Jo. She says, how do you avoid the process of acting intentionally, feeling very serious all the time? I sometimes feel like I'm missing silliness or playfulness because I'm thinking everything through so much.
That is such a great question. And something we care a lot about, because Alex and I are quite silly and humorous, and sometimes these deep explorations of your ethics and your values can feel quite heavy and a bit solemn. And we really actually do want to combat this, because one of the most important things that happens in a community is that it is somewhere that you play, and it's somewhere that you have joy and somewhere that you have fun. And those are values that should be lived through within a culture just as much as everything else. And it is a bit about balancing that. And it is a bit about how you talk about things and how you deliver things and how you make space for that fun within the conversation. Alex, do you want to build on that?
Well, people know what I say on this is we're messy humans, right? So what is good and what is bad needs to be explored. And then about this intent, and some of you might get very tired of me saying that. I believe that language helps us look at things slightly differently. And the articulation that I love is radiating intent. So I talk a lot about radiating intent, which is already much more playful. It's warm. You know, I imagine this to be a massive big sun. And, you know, hey, you're only doing as good as you can in that moment. Are you going to trip up? Is that okay? And I think, again, role modeling, right? If you, as the founder, go, yeah, I don't think that was a smart idea and we're not going to do this again, then that's okay.
Yeah, as we said before, we think all of this is about experimenting, and experimenting is inherently fun. So you even think about a science fair experimentation where you're making one of the exploding volcanoes. The fun in that is that it explodes and something might go wrong, but you know, it was a moment to witness, and you have an opportunity to clean it up and to come together in order to do that.
Thank you both. I'm going to share a recommendation that Vivian's put in the chat that you might also find interesting around playfulness. She said, we're recently super inspired by Maria Akasso's art thinking. Pleasure through art practice is a way for everyone to produce valuable knowledge. Pleasure is allowed and joy is a portal. That sounds great. I'm going to follow that up. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to go back to a kind of really fundamental and really useful question actually from Katie, who says, how is culture different to values?
Okay, so values are part of culture, yeah, and values, when I put my kind of social science hat on, are loosely defined as codified beliefs. Those are values, you know, what we believe in. Culture goes the next step because it is also coming alive in behaviors. And that is what a lot of people call principles. So principles are codified behaviors. So I would say culture is all about values and about behaviors. And that is where at times you need to check in with each other, because when I started to go into business, it was the glorious 90s. And at that time, I came from the creative industries and I worked in agencies, and everybody had kind of jumped on the wagon of, we have to have the shared values. Everybody has to have shared values. And I think what we started to see is that some organizations, especially early on, a lot in the tech sector, had not really created cultures. They started to create cults. Yeah, you're either in or out. If you do not believe this, you have nothing to do in this organization. Personally, I find this difficult, and I'm very happy that we've started to see these things differently, and that I welcome if somebody comes with a different belief. However, working with each other, what we do need to agree on is how do we want to behave. So I'm much more comfortable to talk about intent and behaviors than necessarily about all of our beliefs need to be shared. I don't know whether that is helpful, but maybe.
I think that was helpful. Thank you. Joe just says I'm smiling. So I think a lot of what you're saying is resonating with people. Do share any more questions that you have in the chat. While we wait for those, I'm going to use my prerogative and ask my own question, if that's okay. We've talked a little bit about this before, and I'm interested in a lot of the work we do is partnership and partnership working and collaborations with larger companies, with universities, with artists, with smaller companies, with startups. So how do you set these principles and behaviours and values and cultures, and how do you make them work together across lots of different cultures and behaviours and principles? How does that work? How do you set that up to succeed?
Sam, do you want to say something?
One of those hilarious moments you're seeing whose mouth opens first. So I think there's two parts to that. The first one is really, as we said, starting with having an open conversation about what are those values and that you want to have be shared within that partnership, and really contracting with each other on how do we want to behave? What are the things that we would like to see and how this all comes apart or comes together, not apart. And then the follow-up to that is exactly as we've said in our talk, start to design all of your processes to have those values come to life within them. So how are you deciding who has sign off on a project? What do you value? What have you contracted? And then make that decision with that in mind. What does that look like? If you value inclusion in all of that, then how are you ensuring that the processes of how you're making decisions includes people? How are you ensuring that people are able to express their opinions? How is that opinion being honored? It's not just a tick box exercise, but how are you actually creating and designing things that allow for follow-up? Or to take the process in a different way even. Alex, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. So I always believe that there's two things in any creative partnership or business partnership that you need to check in with. A, how do we want to be with each other? And then how we want to work with each other. And what happens most of the time is that we jump immediately into two, and we're starting to talk about processes and ways of working, and we hand each other our playbooks. And no, that's the second part. The first part is really, how do we want to be with each other? And I use, again, a coachy word, which is the team alliance. It's about creating an alliance and agreeing what is okay, what is not so okay, where are the boundaries, where do we deeply align, and where might we not, and that is okay. And I think people are really scared to have these difficult conversations at the beginning because they believe that that means that they don't believe in the strength of the relationship. I hear that a lot also in my coaching practice. If I start to talk about potential problems, doesn't that mean that I don't trust in the relationship? And I go, no, that just means that you're probably going to be much better when those problems happen. So that would be my recommendation all the time.
Yeah, and I'll build on that in terms of one of the other really scary things people don't want to talk about sometimes in the beginning of a partnership is, what are the incentives that every partner has in order to be collaborating in this moment? And they might not be the same. And so actually putting that on the table in terms of, here's my incentive to be here in this moment, and finding ways to navigate what that is also really important.
Thank you. That is super helpful. I have one more question here from Claire. She said, what happens when your resources don't match your aspirations? Do you move your place on the scale, reconsider your aspirations, make a compromise, or begin as best you can?
Personally, I think if you are trying to make decisions that aren't grounded in reality, then you are not going to achieve what you want to achieve. And so I think it is doing as best you can based on the reality of your moment, and just being very open with that, while still balancing with knowing where it is you want to go. It's part of that intent.
Yeah, and dream yourself into the possibilities step by step is incredible, and do that together. So I think one of the things that makes life so joyful is when we are in relationship, whether we are in relationship with other people, whether we are in relationship in communities, even if we are in relationship with ourselves. People who are kind of like being in relationship with themselves, generally, slightly happier bunch. And I think, do this together. And that would be also my tip. Do it together, because then actually it can be super joyful, super fun. not having the resources is one of the biggest aha moments that I had when I came out of a very traditional big corporate organization into small startups, and you had all the dreams. And I totally agree with Sam. No, sit down and just go, okay, this is what I have to work with. And then go, all right, so how does that work? And where do we want to be? But always check in, is that possible? And I believe that if you check back in, is that possible? A lot of times you might find a new way that could arise of being possible. So the danger about having one big dream is that you are, I don't know what the English word is, but you are like a horse with these funny things, right? And I see that there is a lot of beauty in having one amazing dream, but just be aware of those things, because there are so many other dreams out there, and you can dream them together.
Mm-hmm. It's about answering, what can I do today to get to where I want to be tomorrow?
That is very deep. We are in a deep space.
There was a suggestion really early on in the chat that we should all go for dinner together. And I think that's such a lovely idea. We'd spend some more time unpicking all of these things.
Yeah, 6 at a time.
Yes, yeah, groups of 6. Can I ask you, sort of scroll back quite far in your talk to your first provocation around examples of best practice and companies that you admire who are doing culture well. Have you got some examples of people that you've worked with?
This isn't someone we've worked with. It is actually just being fun. There is this sock delivery company in Canada who are all about being wacky and fun. And I think their tagline is "Bring joy to your every day through your feet." And so they deliver like funny socks with crazy designs once a month. And I bought it for a friend of mine, and in every single one they had a little placard with a joke and an anecdote or something to make you laugh. And everything on their social media presence like embodied that. And we actually were out for drinks one time, and we met somebody who worked at that company, and they were telling us all about how every meeting they opened was with a joke, and that was how they wrote the placards. And so that, I think, is just such a random but funny example of, you know, how that culture emanated out of that organization. You could feel it as a customer, but then, you know, to meet somebody who worked in that business and to talk about how they actually brought it to life in terms of, you know, just their daily meetings and how they started the day was, I thought, really good.
Yeah, and I have maybe an example for closer to home. So I'm alongside working with Sam on Consequential, I'm also a member of a cooperative, the Dot Project. And the Dot Project is a consultancy who helps charities to kind of find their own digital articulation. And what I love about the Dot Project is that we are really exploring how to create a culture as a cooperative. And it's really hard, but it's also really fun. And we do that through incredible honesty, openness. There have been some really difficult moments because everybody in the cooperative have very strong opinions, are very, very passionate. But yeah, I think seeing it as being business critical. And I think that is where we fall flat often, you know, that we say, oh, we need to also still go through, I don't know, you know, that balance sheet. Yes, we do. And we also need to do this. This is business critical. Mm-hmm. Our finance director in the cooperative is now completely on board. He absolutely understands that. And he goes, no, you need to talk this through. And I think that is a moment of beauty. And we're having an awful lot of laughs, and we're getting a lot of things wrong. And then we just fix them together.
Thank you. They're 2 brilliant examples. And I actually really now want some funny socks. I'm going to look them up. Thank you. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time today. I want to say thank you again, Sam and Alex, for a brilliant talk and so many things to mull over. There has been a really interesting discussion in the chat, and I'm sure that will follow on afterwards on various platforms. Please do continue to tweet us or Alex and Sam your questions. You can follow what our Bristol+Bath Creative R+D cohorts are exploring across digital placemaking and expanded performance on our website. I want to do a quick plug for Reframing Digital Placemaking. That's from Monday next week until Friday. Bristol+Bath Creative R+D have curated a week of brilliant events, podcasts, videos and articles from our digital placemaking fellows. Everything is online and you can join in on Twitter as the fellows take over the Bristol+Bath Creative R+D account. As I said already, next week's talk is part of the Reframing Digital Placemaking Week. It is localising the internet, 3 perspectives on digital placemaking, with 3 of our digital placemaking cohort, Rosanna Diaz, Stephen Hilton and Mike Rawlinson. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us at PM Studio UK on Twitter or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share the link to this talk. It's available to watch again as soon as the live broadcast is finished. And if you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk, drop us a line and let us know what you want to talk about. We always want to hear from you. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you all again here next week.